Good evening, everyone. I defy you not to have that music in your head until the election is over. Welcome to this Americano Live US election special. And I thought I should start with a sort of insincere apology. Because at the Spectator, as I'm sure you all know, we love to have a diversity of opinions. And when we were trying to come up with who we should have on this event, we scratched our heads for a long time thinking, who can we get who will be a very forceful, eloquent, and witty voice for Kamala Harris? And we completely failed to do that. But this was before we knew that our new editor was Michael Gove, who went onto Radio 4 and told Radio 4 that he wants Kamala Harris to win. But I ran this joke past Michael today because I'm not suicidal, and he found it very funny, I hope, and also would like it to make it clear that he is now a swing voter. So I don't know where he is, here somewhere, laughing ominously. He's now a swing voter. So maybe we'll ask you at the end, Michael, whether you've changed your mind or whether you're still up for grabs. But before we speak to the big fromage, Farage, that's going to be the second part of the show. We're going to do a panel here, which is meant to be a more neutral, studious look at the election and who's going to win it. And I have three excellent guests who've already been introduced, so I won't do it again. But James, I thought I'd start with you as our pollster. The received wisdom over the summer was that Kamala Harris, having sprung up out of nowhere and brought so much joy, was going to win, had it in the bag. And the received wisdom now, it seems, is that Donald Trump has it in the bag. He seems to be winning every day. Received wisdoms are always wrong, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a good question, and pleasure to be here, Freddie. Pollsters are probably not the most trusted people when it comes to US elections, so I'd like to thank you for the spot on stage. Look, the received wisdom was, we were both at the Democratic National Convention when the Democrats were celebrating a new candidate who wasn't going to lose by a landslide, which Joe Biden was. It was very, very clear. And, you know, she was up by 4 or 5 points, and at that point, most people thought, she's got it in the bag, this is a new candidate, this is a new way of doing things, the Democrats can win. And I think what we've basically seen since then is a steady kind of deflation of the Democrat vote versus the Republicans. Now, look, the point is, I don't think that we can call the election at this point. And I actually don't think we might not be able to call it a day after the election. That's how close it's going That's how close it's going to be. The counting may take quite a long time.
That's actually a crucial question, isn't it? Because this is probably the most important event in the world, and nobody knows when it's going to be decided.
No, that's a function of the number of swing states and how they're separated. So there are 7 swing states at this election, and you can roughly put them into 3 buckets. So you've got your kind of Midwestern swing states, your Wisconsins, your Michigans, and then Pennsylvania, which is the kind of key state. You've then got the states in the South that have a very high number of Hispanic voters, so that's Arizona, Nevada, and then you've got your group of North Carolina and Georgia, which has a very, very kind of tense kind of political dynamic there. And the key thing is, we don't know which is going to be what we call the toss-up state, which one is going to be the key to unlock the magic number. The magic number is going to be 270 electoral college votes. Now, here's the thing. If we end up going through Nevada and Arizona, we may not know, because Arizona only splits into about 16 counties, and 60% of the entire state sits in one county, which is Maricopa. And if that's not declared, we may not know the result of the election on the night. And the same is, but if it goes through Pennsylvania, we may know, because it splits into many more small groups. So here's the thing. It could be over very quickly. If there's a polling error, again, for the 3rd time in a row, we could be heading to a kind of surprise strong Trump victory or a surprise strong Harris victory. But my instinct is we're headed to somewhere really, really close, and there may be some delays.
And if, as the received wisdom now suggests, we may be heading towards a surprise Trump victory, a lot of people are putting that down to the fact that Harris is outperforming herself among the white vote and underperforming among the non-white vote. Does your reading of the polling accord with that?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's worth kind of unpacking that. They call it racial depolarization, which sounds like something a lot worse than it sounds. Which is basically, look, the US is, like many English-speaking democracies, is beginning to vote along education lines instead of racial lines. And that is really significant for this election. So there's been a lot of stories about young black men defecting to the Republicans in ever greater numbers. Some polls have it as high as 30%. But the flip side of that is a lot of older, middle-class and upper-class white women who live in the suburbs, who are Republicans, are switching to the Democrats. What does that do? It changes the electoral college map. It makes the South more difficult for the Democrats. It makes the more multiracial swing states more difficult. But what does it also do? It potentially makes it a little bit easier in the Midwest, so Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, to kind of go over the line. And I think you're going to see this also in we're talking about the presidential race, but actually this is also going to happen in the House of Representatives race. So they have a big kind of vote for their legislator, right? And at the minute, that's also a coin toss, if you want to make it any more complicated. And what you're going to see there is really interesting. You're going to see a lot of seats, congressional seats, out of the 435. Many of the Hispanic-heavy and Asian American-heavy districts may well switch to the Republicans this election. And what you will see is a lot of white middle-class districts flip to the Democrats. So what's going on in the US is deeply, deeply interesting.
I know you want to talk about a contingent election, which is what happens if it's a tie, but we don't have enough time.
I think we'll lose.
And we're already mad enough. So, Kate, you are a woman, and you are also an American woman who has a vote in this election. I'm not going to
investigative journalism here, Fred.
Yeah, I've outed you. I'm not going to ask you how you're going to vote because that's very bad manners. But how are you going to vote? I think you won't mind me saying this. You are pretty close to being a never Trumper. Mm-hmm. I thought we might get some booze there, but anyway.
They're holding it in. They're being very polite. Yeah.
You're pretty close to being a never Trumper, but you are more. I would rather die than see Kamala Harris president.
The feelings oscillate given the hour and usually who I'm having to watch speak or who I'm having to write about, because the hatred for me runs pretty deep. I'm by no means on the Trump train, but I was in Trump's queue on Sunday to get into his town hall event in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And for a country that everyone is saying is on the brink of civil war, that is about to descend into chaos, it was an incredibly pleasant event, not just because Trump supporters are so nice and because it was overall quite a family day out, so many young kids, but because democracy was alive and well. There were Harris protesters that were driving around this massive queue. It was going on for blocks and blocks and blocks. I think maybe a couple thousand people couldn't actually get into the event. It was heavily oversubscribed. And there were Harris protesters driving around the blocks with their Republicans for Harris signs or their flags for Harris and Waltz. And everyone was laughing and kind of friendly, yelling back and forth. And there was like what I can only really describe as like a flag off where Harris and Trump supporters were trying to wave their flags more vigorously. It was really nice to see. And that gave me some hope. But to return to the question of how on earth you can support anybody in this election. Look, I know I'm not alone. There's a brilliant column from our columnist Lionel Shriver in The Spectator this week, just talking about the agony of having to choose between a candidate who in 2020 refused to accept the results, and for many Americans just rules them out completely as a legitimate candidate, and having as your other serious option somebody who very rarely can put a full sentence together. And who, for talking about Venn diagrams and complex things, doesn't always know how to put those ideas coherently together. It's a tough state that America finds itself in with its candidates, but I was relieved to see democracy alive and well.
And you wrote an excellent piece in The Spectator this week saying that Donald Trump is probably going to win because he's funny. And that ties into what I think, which is that Trump is the greatest joke that God has ever written.
He is a gift that keeps on giving and a bomb that keeps on exploding. I think it works both ways. Well, look, as you said, gut instincts tend to be wrong. And what's been so remarkable about this election, and Fred, you and I have discussed this on Americano a couple of times, is how quickly things seem to have changed. It's like we've had 10 elections in a couple of months. We've had not one, but 2 assassination attempts. We have had multiple debates with multiple Democratic candidates in those debates. We've had moments where it thought that Donald Trump was done and dusted, and now it really feels like he's on the up again. And I think there is this sense with Trump that when he's down, and he's been down a lot over the past couple of years, he's angry, he's vengeful, he's nasty, he wants to embrace his ugliest side. And when he's on the up, when he thinks he's doing well, he's really very funny, and it's what his critics hate the most. They can't admit how funny he can be. He gets the audience laughing, and it's clever on 2 counts, because people like to laugh, they like to feel good. And when people are laughing, they don't ask as many questions. So you can throw out any number you want, you can throw out any fact you want. People are laughing, they're not asking questions. It's a hugely successful tactic for Trump. He clearly thinks he's on the up and he's on a roll, because in Pennsylvania, he was very funny, and critics like me, they can't help but laugh.
What is your funniest Donald Trump moment?
Ever?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, I think it's okay, immediately it's a tie between when he finally sat down with Kim Jong-un and asked the media to pan their slim sides. And Kim was like, what's going on? And I thought to myself, I don't know what foreign policy this is, but I think I like it. This feels good to me. And I remember really early on, I was in the States. I must have been visiting my family. This was 2016. He was campaigning. I don't even know if he was the nominee yet. It was really early on, and I was watching one of his rallies on TV. And he was doing that speech. I'm going to paraphrase it really poorly, but he was like, we're going to win. We're going to win. We're going to win so much you're going to say, Mr. President, can't we lose? Can't we just lose once? And I'm going to say no. We're going to keep winning. I thought that's great domestic policy. I don't know what it is, but it's fantastic.
Tim, I'm going to start by throwing you in the deep end and asking you for your funniest Trump moment.
Oh, I think it has to be 2016 during the Fox debate, when the host said to him, Mr. Trump, you have called women sluts, ugly, dogs. And he leant into the microphone and said, only Rosie O'Donnell. By the way,
That's pretty good.
The way to do a Trump impersonation is to say Rosie O'Donnell as if you were revving up a motorbike. Rosie O'Donnell!
I'm not even going to attempt that. James, I didn't tell you that I was going to do this, so do you have a favourite Trump funny moment?
I do, yeah. I think when he started dancing to YMCA, like this, in the 2020 election, and, you know, Biden was 6 points ahead. And I remember looking at the video and thinking, nah, it's going to be a lot closer.
Well, mine is probably one you all know, but it's a classic. Is when he was president, he was doing a sort of pre-Christmas photo op stunt where he was on the phone to a child talking about Christmas, and he said, "Do you still believe in Santa Claus? Because at 7 it's marginal, right?" But Tim, let's turn serious.
Yes.
What a lot of people we've been talking about the race issue and the gender divide in the electorate. But a lot of other people think that it's really to do with class.
Yes.
And quite a well-informed, it doesn't sound like a well-informed thing to say this, but I think it was in a way. Quite a well-informed punter said to me, the simplest way to divide Trump and Harris voters is people who go into a bar and order beer and people who go into a bar and order wine. And obviously beer.
Yes.
I mean, class is hard for data to capture. But do you get that sense that that's what's really happening?
I've always had that sense. Another way of putting it, someone said, it's a choice between people who are lectured and people who lecture. Right, both metaphorically and literally, in many ways. I should add, by the way, I'm always worried when we joke about Trump that this might be 1936 and we'd all be joking that Hitler has such a dry sense of humor. And then in 3 years' time, we look dreadful. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not pro-Trump, I'm Trump adjacent, right? So I do think it's class. I've been writing about politics for 20 odd years, and if I could speak to myself 20 years ago and tell myself back then that in the future in America, gay marriage will be legal, but Roe v. Wade will be off the books. And the race will be a tight contest between a black woman, liberal black woman from California, and Donald Trump, who will be running for the third time. And by the way, he's just won the endorsement of America's only Muslim mayor. Then I would be very surprised by that. And we've got to remember that for a long time, American politics since the 30s was really about class. And then from the 60s onwards, it was about class, region, and race, such that Republicans, they could count on the West and the South, they could count more or less on suburban voters, and crucially, they could always count on whites. And it remains an astonishing fact that if only white Americans had the vote, and there are some Americans who would like it to be that way, if only white Americans had the vote, the Democrats would have lost every election since 1968, right? Even Bill Clinton lost the white vote. White people still overwhelmingly vote that way. But within white people, you are starting to see that divide on the basis of exactly where they live, so that rural areas are now overwhelmingly Republican. Urban areas are still Democrat, but the suburbs are tilting away from the Republicans. And we're starting to see that cleavage on the basis of education and income. It remains a truism, by the way, and we must never get carried away with this, it remains a truism that poor people vote left. By and large, very poor people tend to vote left. But there are still interesting iterations within that based upon the education they've got precisely where they live. So we can reasonably say Donald Trump has brought something new to the Republican coalition, which is an appeal to blue-collar workers. Now, of course, the interesting question is that, as we've been discussing, his unique character? Can that go away? Or is that tied in some way to philosophy? And as you know, you used to work for the American Conservative, which is linked to Pat Buchanan. There has been a small...
Thanks for helping me on that one.
Right. But there's a small conservative clique which has been arguing for a revival of 1930s policy interests, like being tough on immigration, being against jobs going overseas, and being anti-war. That small conservative clique has been saying for decades, you know, we can win white blue-collar votes off the back of that. And we might even pick up some poorer Hispanic people. We might even pick up some particularly African-American males. And the interesting thing, as Nate Cohn wrote recently, is if Donald Trump is talking in dog whistles, the dog whistles go down really well with ethnic minorities. They too poll that they want to see a strong border. They too poll that they think crime is out of control. So what I don't just think it's Trump's personality is what I'm trying to say. I think what's coming into fruition is a public policy debate that's been going on since the end of the Cold War about basically nationalism versus globalization. And there is a new alignment to class interests around that. And Donald Trump, not necessarily on purpose, has managed to galvanize that and turn it into a new electoral coalition. And whether he wins or not, this is the really interesting thing, his policy agenda will still largely be pursued. Because under Biden, what have we actually seen? The reshoring of jobs to America, a tough border policy, eventually, not to begin with, but eventually, and withdrawal from Central Asia and the Middle East. Those are the central planks of Trumpism. And Democrats are now saying we'll do that too. So yes, I do think it's a new class coalition. I do think it's linked to philosophy. And I think the clever Democrats, like Starmer, copying reform in this country or copying the conservative Brexit agenda, the clever Democrats are imitating Trump.
James, do you agree with that? I think one of the more interesting things between 2024 and 2020 is that Biden had the union support. So he was able to pull quite a lot of blue-collar support back to the Democrats. And as far as we know, union voters, blue-collar workers, are supporting Trump in bigger numbers than before. That's correct, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. I'm not going to disagree with Tim, but I see it through a slightly different lens. And I would go back to a fairly suspect economist, but a good political analyst, and that's Thomas Piketty, who basically pointed out that the world is divided into what he called the merchant right and the Brahmin left. And what he meant by that, basically, was that how you vote is basically a function of the amount of money that you have for the given level of education that you have. So the most right-wing people in the world are people with lots of money, with very low levels of formal education. And then he called them the merchant right. And then the people on the left, very overeducated and very underpaid. And he called them the Brahmin left. And then the swing voters ended up being people who were very well educated and very well paid, and also people who were very underpaid and not very well educated. And actually, I think that describes the class dynamics, because what's basically happened across the Western world is that education and income have become decoupled from each other. Like 30 years ago, they walked in lockstep with each other, and now they don't. And this is the new politics, it's the interaction. It's also where your money's from as well. Is your money from the public sector? Is it from the education establishment, or is it from the private sector? Is it from small business, or is it from big business? The source of funds is often really important. But in terms of what Biden did, to your question, what he did is actually stop the clock on the realignment very temporarily. So for one moment, America was presented with a candidate quite literally from another decade and another era, and it voted slightly along those lines, right? And this is the guy from Scranton, from Pennsylvania, kind of harking back to the Democrats and their old union kind of roots. I think now what we're seeing is the realignment unchained by two candidates, the Californian prosecutor and Donald Trump. And I think what we're about to see is this kind of pent-up realignment that's going to happen all in one go. But here's where it gets a little bit more complicated, Freddie. I think there's going to be a bit of difference between how people cast their votes for the presidency and how they cast their votes in the House of Representatives. And my instinct is, in the House of Representatives, the realignment will be a bit less strong. So you'll see a bit more classic Republican areas staying Republican, classic Democrat area. Donald Trump is different, really, really different vote, and he's transformed politics. This entire election is a referendum on him.
Kate, let's talk about your favourite woman, Kamala Harris.
Okay.
She's doing pretty badly. I think that's a neutral thing to say. I think the last few weeks have been bad for her. She seems to be performing very badly in interviews. Her appearances on stages have been poor. She did an event with Liz Cheney, and there was this amazing contrast between Trump did this rally in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, after he'd been to McDonald's and an American football match, and these sort of great populist gestures. And then Kamala Harris sat down with Liz Cheney and just, as Tim said, lectured an audience for a while. And it seems like, if we look at the polls, although they haven't moved that much, but it seems like that doesn't go down very well with people.
No, it certainly doesn't. It's fascinating to see the ways that, particularly the Republican Party, I think has moved since the era of Ronald Reagan, but overall politics. I mean, there's a famous debate, if you go back to the 80s, where two candidates for the nomination are in Texas debating who should give, the extent to which children of illegal migrants should have access to schools and have access to university education. And that debate was between Ronald Reagan and Bush Sr., and they were debating each other to see who could be more pro-immigration, how times have changed. But one area where you can see politics in the US has completely moved for the Republicans and for the Democrats is on drug reform, and on migration, and on foreign policy. And in every area, there's more of an isolationist feeling that perhaps the police shouldn't be knocking on your door in your home, perhaps the border needs to be more secure, and perhaps America shouldn't be knocking on the door of other nations. And Kamala Harris just seems to be rejecting all of these things that I think in 2016, and very clearly between Biden and Trump in 2020, became much more of the norm for Americans. So she's the failed border czar. She's advocating a much more interventionist stance, and I'm put Ukraine to the side in every other way, and I think the Liz Cheney moment reflected that. And she's playing up her law and order history in California, which you don't want to dig too much into, because she was incredibly proud about trying to lock up as many, frankly, innocent people as possible, people committing nonviolent crimes anyway, something that the Democratic Party rejected her for in 2020 when she was running for the nominee, and something that Americans feel doesn't sit quite right with them. So the more she's having to talk, and the more that's coming out, the more people don't like. And it is a spectacular own goal, because I think it's also neutral to say that she hands down won the debate against Donald Trump. It was remarkable. They were talking about immigration, and she just threw this random grenade. By the way, people aren't going to your rallies anymore. And the entire debate became about Trump and his narcissism, and she wasn't challenged on a single point. She could have stopped there. And frankly, I think she'd be ahead of the polls. Then they decided to do a media blitz, and she doesn't seem prepared for a single question she has to answer. And when she answers off the cuff, it goes to the topics I was just discussing, where Americans go, we're not quite sure we agree anymore. I mean, to sit in an interview chair, to be asked, what would you do differently from Joe Biden, or what might you change, and to say, I can't think of a single thing. Can you really not think of a single thing? And did nobody prepare you for such an obvious question? It doesn't feel safe, it doesn't feel comfortable, and it doesn't feel like somebody who's prepared for the job. They're neck and neck in the polls because you could say all the same things about Donald Trump. But, the Democrats must deep down be kicking themselves. One of the reasons Joe Biden was kept in post for so long is because they knew that she, as the obvious nominee, was not up to the challenge. And now they're all having to pretend like she's the best thing that could have possibly come their way. And I think they all know it's not true.
She was asked again last night if she could think of a mistake she'd made. And like a bad sort of job interviewee, she said, I'd over-prepare.
That is so worrying.
My staff tell me I over-prepare.
So all these interviews are her on a good day?
She was so well prepared for that interview. Tim, you mentioned the Hispanic vote there, but there was a very interesting poll this week, and it was probably an anomaly, but it was nonetheless very interesting, that Arab Americans, I think it had Trump on 45% with Arab Americans and Harris on 43%, which is pretty striking. Can you explain to the audience what you think might be going on there, or is it just a totally wrong poll?
That's partly they're voting against the incumbent administration, which they blame for taking what they regard as a pro-Israel line over Gaza. It's also because Arab Americans in particular tend to be quite wealthy, so they really ought to be a target Republican group anyway, and they're quite often well-educated. And I would remind people that one of Trump's picks to run for Senate in Pennsylvania was a Muslim at the last set of elections. So it doesn't entirely surprise me. It speaks to the cleavages which do exist within the Democratic base in the same way that they exist in Labour in Britain. And indeed, the parallels go beyond that. I mean, just thinking about what you're talking about with Kamala's style, in the same way that during the last general election, someone said to Keir Starmer, just talk about the tools, right? And whenever he said, I don't know if you know this, but my father was a toolman, every time he said it as if he was saying it for the first time. And the same strange thing about Kamala is she says the same things as if she's saying it for the first time. So she'll say, the thing about democracy is that it's so strong, yet really fragile. And because she has to say it 10 times a day, she tries to mix it up. In the same way, remember Hillary did this, I kind of call it trickle up, trickle down. Kamala does this too, where she'll try and riff as if she's coming up with this for the first time. So she'll say, thinking about it, with democracy, it's like it's really strong, but it's also kind of fragile. This is the product of someone who's playing it super safe. And in the same way that Labour ran on nothing, we won't tell you how we'll spend, we won't tell you what we'll cut, because they thought this was just a referendum on the other people. And they were right. That gamble was correct. The Democrats are likewise gambling on this is just a referendum on Trump. And of course, one thing they do have to their advantage, which we must mention, is abortion. And that's one of the big things that's changed in the last 4 years. On the one hand, many Americans are now reconciled to Trump in a way they weren't in 2016. He's got slightly higher favorables because people are used to him and they think he didn't do a terrible job while he was president. But when it comes to abortion, that's a new thing. And it's a new thing which galvanizes women and which Trump doesn't quite know how to deal with. Because for Trump, it's a delivery, it's a box ticked. You suckers made me nominee saying that I would get rid of Roe v. Wade, and I did, so you've got to love me, right? And now he discovers, yeah, but something like 2/3 of the country hated the policy, and he'd never agreed with it himself anyway. So he's trying to, on the hoof, invent a new Republican position on Roe v. Wade, which is it's a states' rights issue. And God love him, he's resurrected the ghost of Gerald Ford. The last Republican to run on that position was Gerald Ford.
I didn't know you were going to do so many brilliant impressions. So I'm afraid we've overrun.
Okay.
But if anyone has any questions or more impressions they want Tim to do, please ask. I think I can't see anyone. But if you stick your hands up, somebody will come and... I actually can't see a single person. It's very dark out there.
Oh, I think there's a mic over there.
Yeah, hi there. Just last week in New York at the Al Smith dinner, Donald Trump was sat there rubbing shoulders, having jokes with high-ranking Democrats like Chuck Schumer. Yeah. Just yesterday, Kamala Harris compared him with Hitler. Is there a lower form of political discourse than just comparing your rival with Hitler? And on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does that indicate that the Kamala Harris campaign is about to burst into flames?
About to. I think what Tim... you did all the talking last time.
It shows the switch from joy to terror in their campaigning style, right? Because they initially ran on joy, and for about 2 months, for a lot of people, for a lot of Americans, it seemed like all their Christmases had come at once, and she was so great, and she's going to win, and she's going to beat him. And I think the jumping on the fascist stuff is a sign that they are actually nervous. I do think it is a significant moment, yeah.
People should be held to account for what they say. I'm not trying to put Harris's language onto Donald Trump, but Trump has a tendency to bring people to their basis level. And we've seen this in the Democratic Party for some time. They are using his kind of language because they realize it's effective, they realize it's scary, and if you can't run on humor, and Harris cannot run on humor, the next best thing is fear. And I think it's pretty effective for them in certain camps. And of course, it's hard for Donald Trump to point the finger. There was a moment after that first assassination attempt where I really think perhaps the narrative could have changed, but Trump had no interest in changing it either. One of the funniest jokes at the Al Smith dinner is when he said, "Oh, I like Biden now. I didn't like him before when I was running against him, but I like him now. And Harris, I hate her. When I defeat her, I'll like her. But I hate her for now." It's very telling. This is all campaigning tactics, and I think it's really bad for the country, but the candidates clearly think it's good for them in the short term.
Does anyone have a question on... I think one thing we haven't spoken about, because we are short on time, is the vice presidential nominees. Does anyone have a question about that? Yeah?
Result. Sorry, I'll start again. Looking past the result, where will the US be globally? With firstly the Donald and secondly with Caramel in the White House?
That's an easy one for you, James. Where will the US be
It's a real hospital
in the future?
Great, the unfun futurology question. Yeah, I'll take that. I think under Trump, it's a known entity, right? This is the thing. This is the third time he's already been president. People kind of already know what he stands for and what he's going to do. And so we've already played the soundtrack of everything's going to change and blow up and not work. And it didn't happen the first time. It's very hard to replay that again. I imagine the clarity from his kind of economic position will lead potentially to a bit more growth. I think a lot of people involved in the private sector are a bit more kind of pro him and his policies. I think the big unknown with Donald Trump's foreign policy, right? Is he a good partner? Foreign policy. Is a guy that doesn't back NATO a good idea? Is a guy that equivocates over Russia a good idea? And Ukraine? Is a guy that we don't know what he thinks about Taiwan? Is that smart at a point geopolitically? So I think that's what the nervousness around him. Around Harris, I just don't know what, I mean, it's kind of what Kate says. We don't know, because the whole staffer, the whole infrastructure of the Harris campaign is just bought off Joe Biden. And we don't know what she stands for. We don't know what she wants to deliver. We don't know what gets her up in the morning or why she's there, what the job that she wants to do. And I think some of her economic policies may be the ones that attract the most attention. She's talked about raising taxes and the kind of problems that are there, but I think it will just be generic Democrat, is how I imagine Harris. Whereas I think Trump is a whole box of random. It's not generic Republican, and that's the big difference between the two.
I think that's right, and I would add that I think that there is, the power of Trump hatred is waning. I think a lot of people who were very nervous about even saying they found Trump funny 8 years ago are now willing to say openly that they find him funny and charming. And even the Democrats, to a certain extent, have sort of had to change their language a bit on it and say, yes, he can be funny. Or I think he is not as toxic to a lot of people now as he was 8 years ago. Do we have another question?
On the topic of vice presidents, we know that Trump can only do one more term. So do we think that J.D. Vance would be the candidate and or would win the presidency after Trump? Thanks.
I think J.D. Vance would be the strong favorite, but you will have the oldest Republican establishment. There will be some pushback there. Because Trump has lost, they will try and tar J.D. Vance with that. But I think he would be the favorite. Kate?
So I think he would certainly be the favorite in the way Harris got to be the favorite. If you become vice president and there's an opportunity to run, then you're going to be the favorite. Here's the trouble for J.D. Vance. It isn't obvious to me that he's going to be able to galvanize Trump supporters in the same way. And I suspect that because whilst he's a very good public speaker, he doesn't talk to them the same way Trump does. I'm not sure that anybody is going to be able to repeat that. But also crucially, there's a big question as to how many of J.D. Vance's policies are actually implemented were Trump to win. So J.D. Vance is on the record saying that he's not opposed to all tax hikes because tariffs are taxes and he wants to increase tariffs. Now, it is my suspicion that if J.D. Vance gets his way and there is a 10% import tariff slapped on all products coming into the United States, the Republicans will be looking at one term. That will make any tax cut that they do irrelevant. That will be an incredibly painful event for the American consumer. So if J.D. Vance gets to basically run on potential Trump economic wins and dresses them up as incredibly protectionist when they're actually laissez-faire, maybe he's got a shot. But if J.D. Vance gets to run economic policy over the next 4 years, I think he'll struggle.
Tim and Jeb, you very quick, I'm afraid, because as Brett Bard said to Kamala Harris, they're wrapping me up hard here.
I can tell you what won't happen is Tim Walz will not be the next Democratic nominee. But the only problem with the presuming J.D. Vance becomes the heir presumptive is look what happened to Mike Pence. You can't either trust in events and you can't trust Trump's loyalty. I would still put some money aside on Don Jr. I think there's some hope there. And by the way, on the question of what the world will look like, whoever wins, I think that the day after Trump wins, he will double the aid budget to Israel. The day after Kamala wins, she'll halve it.
Interesting. Very, very quick.
Very quickly, I think if Trump loses, I don't think J.D. Vance is the favourite. And just ask how Tim Kaine's presidential bid is going. Not very well. And I think the thing with Vance is that he's populist without being popular. And he lacks the humour, and he lacks the common touch. Yes. And it's really interesting that those fuse with the policy to create an emotional connectivity with the base. So I don't see it.
Well, I think that is all we've got time for, sadly. I wish we could have more of you. But Kate, Tim, and James, thank you very much indeed. Right,